Watching the progress of the Crossrail construction project in London was fascinating in terms of what was unearthed. The Charterhouse Plague Pit was one such buried secret, first uncovered in March 2013. Charterhouse lies between Clerkenwell and Smithfield, just north of the City of London, and the area is allegedly rife with plague pits, although if you believe London law, most of the city is. Research revealed that the Charterhouse skeletons dated back to the 1348 outbreak of plague, an outbreak that decimated London's fledgling population. Yet the plague pit gave rise to schoolyard rumours in the nearby Charterhouse School, with the dead seemingly still screaming in their grave. Ghost sightings give the tranquil square a slightly different kind of appeal. So what is the Charterhouse Plague Pit, and why does the square seem so haunted? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We are starting a brand new theme this month, and because the one where I looked at the different ghost stories of European cities was quite popular, I thought, you know what, I'm going to do another city-based one. And this time we're going to be having a look at general folk tales and legends concerning the four capitals in the United Kingdom. So that's London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. And we're starting off with London, just purely because it's the one that I actually lived in. There's otherwise no rhyme or reason to the order I'm doing them in. And we're going to have a look at the Charterhouse Plague Pit. Now, this is actually a piece of folklore that I did come across quite some time ago, but it was only in March that I actually got to visit Charterhouse Square, where the whole thing unfolds. So I felt that having actually been meant that this particular thing was easier to cover. But I should point out that this particular episode doesn't just contain legends of the Plague Pit, it also has some ghosts in it as well. So if you like ghost stories, then this episode is for you. But just to give you an idea about London plague pits more generally, this particular part of London that we're talking about actually lay outside the walls of the original medieval city. And like I say, it's just near Smithfield Market if you know London at all, and it's quite an easy walk from Clerkenwell as well. But like I say, it wasn't the only plague pit. Another one apparently lies in Bunhill Fields, now beloved as a favourite lunch spot by local city workers. And I must admit, I literally used to work in one of the offices that kind of backed onto Bunhill Fields, and it was a really nice place to have lunch in the summer. Now, most of the legends of plague pits are generally around the London Underground, and obviously there's an entire episode on the London Underground if you're interested in that kind of lore. But according to a particular urban legend, the Piccadilly line follows a rather strange bend at the edge of Green Park to skirt the edge of one such plague pit. The construction of the Victoria line apparently encountered another pit. Now, I should point out that Scott Wood notes that there are no archival references to the digging of the Victoria line disturbing dead bodies, and in a lot of ways developers actually know exactly where mass graves are because they do appear on maps. And I should point out as well that few organisations have quite the same records as TfL and all the different railways that made up the London Underground, so I kind of feel like if they had actually come across a plague pit while digging, they would have had a record of it somewhere. But you do end up with this kind of thing where any time there's an empty patch of ground in London, it gets called a plague pit regardless of the truth. Now, that being said, over by the City of London, Bank, Liverpool Street and Aldgate stations were all supposed to have been built on plague pits. Now, in the case of Liverpool Street Station, it's not actually that far from the truth, because more work with Crossrail unearthed the mass grave in 2015, and the 30 skeletons there were believed to have been victims of the Great Plague outbreak of 1665. So in some cases there's like a nugget of truth behind it, but in other cases perhaps not so much. Because before the 1665 outbreak, people buried plague victims either in churchyards or in the grounds of the nearest pest house. And these pest houses were hospitals specifically to isolate plague victims from the rest of the community. It's almost like they understood the value of quarantining people. But the truth is, there just aren't actually as many plague pits as people assume that there are. But we do know the Charterhouse Plague Pit exists. Now, this particular area probably became a plague pit due to its location half a mile north of the city walls. So at this point, you have to try and imagine London not being as built up as it is now. And I mean, that's really difficult to do if you remember way back when we did the Mother Redcap episode and thinking about Camden as being this rural idyll. And if you've been to Camden, you'll know that it's anything but. And it is a bit of a weird concept to try and imagine what London was like sort of before it got so choked up as it is now. But as I say, this would have been quite a quiet sort of area. Because it was away from the city walls, it made a better location because you don't really want to be burying people in plague pits right next to living places. Now, some people say that the authorities interred around 50,000 people in the mass grave during the 1349 plague epidemic, and basically what happened was the Bishop of London didn't like the idea of them being buried in unconsecrated ground, so he actually donated the land to make a graveyard, and then also they built an attached chapel as well. And the square was apparently for a time called Pardon Churchyard. In 1381, Sir Walter de Manny established one of England's 9 Carthusian monasteries on the north side of the square, and it basically fell to the monks to pray for the souls of those buried in the plague pit. Now, during the Tudor era, this was actually a super wealthy part of the city, and it was popular precisely because it was away from the dirt and disease of the city. Sir Catherine Parr, the wife that survived Henry VIII, lived in the square with her second husband, and apparently both the ambassadors from France and Venice had houses in the square. Yet despite all this luxury, there was still a stone cross at the centre of the square, marking the burial place of the Black Death victims in 1349. A former soldier named Thomas Sutton ended up with the Charterhouse. He'd actually made his fortune in the coalfields in the northeast, and in 1611 he actually founded the Charterhouse as a hospital to care for men who would serve the king, obviously like in army or navy terms. A school also opened, which does become important when we get to the folklore, but that eventually moved to Godalming in Surrey in 1872. Now, I must admit, I visited the Charterhouse pretty much by accident back in March when I was in the area and I wandered in. And it's fairly typical of me. I was basically having to walk from Clerkenwell to pretty much anywhere I needed to go because it was one of the days when there was a tube strike on and you could not get on a bus for love nor money. And I just found myself wandering and I thought, oh, I'll go along and I'll have a look in Charterhouse Square and I'll actually take a proper photo of it myself. Realised I needed the toilet and I was like, oh, the Charterhouse is open and it's free. I'll go in and see if they've got one. And then I ended up actually having a look around it. And it's quite a compact but tranquil spot. The staff are lovely, mind. They're really, really welcoming and they'll tell you the best places to have a look at. There's a little museum as well. And the little cloister bit that they've got feels like something that you'd see in a Tudor TV show, essentially. It doesn't take a long time to go around it, and I didn't see any ghosts as far as I'm aware. I mean, I'm assuming that was a guide that welcomed me. But I did see one of the plague skeletons in the museum. So if you're interested in the history of the Charterhouse itself, but also the square, it is quite a good place to visit. But anyway, you're here for the plague pit history and the folklore. So with all this history going on, you might be wondering what actually happened to the plague pit. Well, it basically lay there largely undisturbed until Crossrail came along. Now, obviously, there would have been disturbances as well with people actually building the square and so on. But by and large, it was kind of Crossrail that actually investigated it properly. And the archaeologists actually found that the pits took the form of quite narrow trenches and the bodies lay in rows. And I remember when I read about this, scholars were really quite surprised at the level of order in the burials. And that in itself, I think, is quite surprising because you might expect a plague outbreak to be a time of chaos and widespread fear. And quite frankly, I think the way that certain places dealt with the COVID pandemic most recently, we can kind of see that, oh my God, we've actually got too many bodies, we don't know what to do with them. So you would imagine it would be the same with the plague. And, you know, you hear rumours about the poor being thrown into the pits while they were still alive. So you would expect it to be quite chaotic spaces, but apparently not during the Black Death epidemic. Because even here, the gravediggers were actually trying to maintain some level of dignity for them, which I think is actually quite comforting in a weird sort of way. So yeah, they're all just kind of like laid out as if it's more of a mass burial rather than a mass grave, if that makes sense. But obviously you can't have a plague pit in a major city and not have ghost stories grow up about it. So while the pit itself lay largely undisturbed until 2013, the stories certainly try to bring its inhabitants to life. So one ghost story claims that those who walk past the site of the Charterhouse Plague Pit can hear the cries of those buried alive among the bloated corpses. And meanwhile, when the school was still on the site, legend has it that the older boys used to tell tales about what lay beneath the cobbles of the schoolyard. And apparently if you pressed your ear against the stones, you'd hear the screams of the plague victims below. According to Scott Wood, the boys actually would dare each other to crawl across the square at midnight, and then apparently this was when you could actually hear the groans and cries of the dead below. And this, I must admit, did actually go on to inspire a story that I wrote called The Charterhouse Bullies, which you can find in my Black Dog and Other Gothic Tales collection, and I've put a link to that below. Also, because talking about the London Underground, there is a story in that based on the ghosts of the British Museum as well, so just so you know. But anyway, when I visited the museum at the Charterhouse, there was an information panel, and it actually explained that human skeletons were often unearthed on the site, which must have been quite grisly. And ghost stories written by the boys appeared in the school magazine, suggesting that there was quite a long history of stories associated with such osteological finds within the school. And I think anyone who's ever actually been around sort of kids and teenagers will know that, if you were to find a skeleton, somebody would clearly make something up about it. So I think it's quite interesting that this almost falls into like children's lore in a way, but then it's sort of become attached to the site anyway and kind of feeds into some of the other legends about the idea of people being able to hear things when they walk past. Now, that is also not all that you will find in Charterhouse Square, and I did promise you ghosts, because after the monastery opened, the monks prayed for the plague victims buried outside the gates beneath the square. But their own tragedy erupted during the Reformation, and the monks basically refused to accept Henry VIII as the new head of the church, and the prior, John Houghton, was actually hung, drawn and quartered in an attempt to break the monks, and his arm was actually placed over the Charterhouse's main gate as a reminder of the king's might. The other friars apparently then reported nightly visits by their dead leader, and they continued to refuse Henry's demands, and even the execution of 16 of them didn't diminish their resolve, although their heads were unfortunately added to London Bridge. Now, according to legend, the shadowy ghost of a monk still haunts the area after dark. He's sometimes described as a dark monk, but for some reason many monk ghosts seem to be described in unflattering terms, and I don't know if it's just because of what they actually wear, or if people have just automatically assumed a monk ghost must therefore somehow be like a black monk kind of thing. I don't know, but I kind of feel like any monks that were haunting the area are probably going to be a bit annoyed of what happened to them, but I don't see why they would necessarily be malevolent. And there doesn't seem to be any stories about any of the monks actually attacking people just see them. And according to one legend, if you actually went to one of the alleys around the Charterhouse at dusk and you stood at one end and then whistled 3 times, a ghost would appear at the other end of the alley. Now, according to Grace Jackson, who lived in the square between 1880 and 1892, she actually tried it and it did work, with the ghost pursuing her and her brother through the gardens. You do have to wonder, was it actually a ghost or was it an annoyed warden? But either way, it does make for quite a nice little addition to the story. Now, obviously, the dissolution of the monastery saw the monastery converted into a mansion house, and Sir Edward North, who had once hosted Queen Elizabeth I in the building, then sold it to the man who would become perhaps the most notorious inhabitant of the Charterhouse. And this man was the infamous Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, who basically became embroiled in the plot to depose Elizabeth I and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. And indeed, it was actually Howard's plan to marry Mary at one point. Howard was eventually executed as a traitor, and according to legend, his headless ghost still appears in the Charterhouse. Now, apparently he does favour the main staircase, and he just strides down it with his head under his arm, which I imagine probably would stick in your mind if you were to see something like that. Now, the stories do claim that there's some 35,000 spectres lurking in the square, but I kind of feel like there'd probably be a few more reports if they were actually all seen at the same time. So ultimately, what do we make of Charterhouse Square, its ghosts and its plague pit? Well, if you visit the place now, it's quite a tranquil oasis of calm, and it is just a stone's throw from the bustle of Smithfield Market. Now, the Charterhouse itself is a quiet gem off the main tourist trail, and if you are in London, I do recommend that you pop in because it is really nice in there. But the atmosphere is still a bit of a slightly odd one in the square itself, even on a bright Wednesday afternoon in March. Now, it's hardly surprising that schoolboys would tell each other ghost stories, given the school's proximity to the graveyard and obviously kids being kids. But whether these stories were based on earlier legends or were the result of a fine imagination, obviously that remains lost to time. But the addition of newer tales in which ghostly monks and the spectral Duke of Norfolk stalk the corridors certainly seems to conjure up more phantoms than the plague pit seems to. And this is the thing with the plague pit, you tend to hear a lot about the idea of screams of the dead, but you don't get that many reports of people actually seeing them, if that makes sense. So it's quite an interesting sort of auditory haunting more than anything else. But who knows, perhaps the plague pit finally lies at peace, since the Black Death obviously lies so much further back in time. Who knows, perhaps the monks and the Duke will eventually one day find peace as well. So I want to know, have you been to Charterhouse Square? Do you live in Charterhouse Square? It is a very nice part of town, to be fair. If you are familiar with the place and you have seen or heard something unusual there, please do feel free to let me know. I always like kind of hearing people's engagement with these stories and legends, and indeed places as well. So that would be really cool. We are going to visit Edinburgh next week, which is like probably my third favourite place in the whole British Isles that I've been to. And it's a bit difficult with Edinburgh because I've already done bonus episodes for my Patreon supporters on the Edinburgh Vaults and Mary King Close. And obviously we've already met the Mackenzie Poltergeist in a previous episode of the podcast, so I'll have to try and find something else to do. But it's Edinburgh. There's like you can't throw a rock without hitting something that's got a stone attached to it. So that'll be good. And if you're listening to this before Monday, there is my talk at 6 p.m. British Summer Time with Cresswell Crags about harvest folklore and superstitions, and you're more than welcome to come along and attend that. And I am also slowly going back through a lot of my illustrated talks, and I'm starting to make them available as pre-recorded access on demand with captions, talks that you can then buy and watch whenever you want. So I have put the link to those below. I have only got 2 at the moment, but I will be adding more over time as well. So I hope that you find those useful and also appreciate the improved access to things that I've sort of done in the past, or indeed some of them I've only ever done them in person. So if you didn't get to go because of geography, then now you can get to see them. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope to see you on Monday. And if you're listening to this after Monday, then I just hope that you have a lovely week ahead. And I'll see you next week when we head off to Edinburgh. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.